A thoroughly amateur production, as the title card makes clear, as the lighting makes clear, as the total lack of anything resembling professional camera work or what have you makes clear. This is going to be the third video that I make for the Whiskey for Beginners channel. And in the first one, actually this is the fourth one, but it's the third numbered one, if that makes any sense. I have my own system. The first, without a number, is what is Whiskey for Beginners? What is this channel? Then what is whiskey and how do you make whiskey? Now today, in this video, I want to answer the question, what kinds of whiskey are there? And whiskey is an overarching term. It means any spirit distilled from a grain mash. And you can go back to the second video, video number 2, and find out what that is. But within that, there are different kinds of whiskey, just like under the comprehensive term automobile, you have pickup trucks, you have station wagons, you have SUVs, you have what have you. And whiskey's the same way. You have whiskey, and under that term you have several different kinds. Some kinds get their name from the country they come from. Some get their name from who knows where. Some get their name from the main grain that you make them from. I'm not going to consider Canadian whiskey or Australian whiskey or Japanese whiskey as a kind of whiskey. They're more just whiskeys from those countries. And really the United States has the strictest laws and regulations of any regarding what you can call whiskey, what each particular kind of whiskey must be. Scotland and Ireland perhaps come in next. But, you know, to a certain extent, when you get outside the United States, Scotland and Ireland, a whiskey is just the whiskey that comes from that country. They don't differentiate it like we do. So, what kinds of whiskey are there? Basically, in very general terms, you have bourbon whiskey, which is a purely American whiskey. It's it's whiskey night. It's bourbon night. Can you tell I'm thoroughly amateur? The channel called It's Bourbon Night has t-shirts which say that bourbon is America's only native spirit, and that is a true fact. Bourbon was invented here, and you can only make bourbon in the United States. You don't have to make it in Kentucky. That's just a myth. But you do have to make it in the United States. That's law. And bourbon is whiskey. People will ask, I've had people ask me, what's the difference between bourbon and whiskey? Well, I like to answer that by saying, what's the difference between a Volkswagen and a car? Well, a Volkswagen is a car. Exactly. Bourbon is whiskey. It's distilled from a mash made of grain, which is what whiskey is. Now, I'm going to, in the next video, talk about what is bourbon, so I won't go into detail here, but bourbon is a kind of whiskey. It's a peculiarly American kind of whiskey. It was invented here, and you cannot make it in any other country on earth. If you have a distillery which has 2 production lines, one 10 feet south of the border with Canada, one 10 feet north, one in the United States, one in Canada, and they do everything exactly alike, following the laws and rules of bourbon, the whiskey that comes off the south side will be bourbon. The whiskey that comes off the north cannot legally be bourbon. Interesting that, but that's what it is. So you have bourbon, you have Scotch, which is Scottish whiskey. There are laws and regulations, but that term Scotch is really an English term. It comes from England, not from Scotland. The Scots, S-C-O-T-S, call themselves Scots. They do not say Scotch. That is an English term. It's what the English have long called the Scots. And it has become the accepted name, even in Scotland, for Scottish whiskey. Although in Scotland, usually they'll just say whiskey because that's what there is the most of. There is an export market from Japan, from the United States, from various countries, but in the United States, your most whiskey is going to be from American distilleries. In Scotland, most whiskey will be from Scottish distilleries. They might call it malt because Scottish whiskey mostly is made from malted barley that's been sprouted and then heated to stop the sprouting, and they call that malting the barley. You can do it with any grain, but Scotch whiskey is largely made from sprouted barley. And I don't have it planned, but I might in the future do a video on what is Scotch whiskey, what is Irish whiskey. I'm not very expert on those, so that's still up in the air. You have bourbon, you have Scotch whiskey. Irish whiskey is very much like Scottish whiskey. There are some differences. I'm not an expert. I couldn't begin to go into all of them. But a main difference, or at least a major difference, is that Scottish whiskey comes to at least a great extent off of column stills, while Irish whiskey largely comes off of pot stills. And a column still is more efficient. You can run it continuously. It can get the alcohol to a higher proof more easily, but a pot still retains more of the flavor of the original grain, and so you balance those things. And there are some distillers in Scotland, Ireland, the United States who will use both column stills and pot stills to achieve what they want. Then there's rye whiskey. Now, this is not indigenous to the United States, although if you've watched many Western movies, you're liable to remember a cowboy walking up to the bar and saying, "Rye." That was the first whiskey that people made in the United States. It was rye whiskey which was behind the Whiskey Rebellion during George Washington's administration as the first president of the United States under the Constitution. And rye is suited to a cooler, or at least colder, cooler climate, what have you. And after the Whiskey Rebellion, some of those Pennsylvania farmers moved south into what's now Tennessee and Kentucky, and they found rye didn't grow so well there, but corn did, and so they started making corn whiskey. Now, rye whiskey under American law has to have a mash of at least 51% rye. Bourbon has to have a mash of at least 51% corn. But to be corn whiskey, it has to have a mash of at least 80% corn. That's to differentiate it from corn-based whiskey that isn't corn whiskey. And corn whiskey has to age either in a used charred barrel or a new uncharred barrel. So you could take the same mash bill, put some of it over here into new charred oak barrels and make bourbon, and the rest over here into new uncharred or used charred barrels and make corn whiskey, as long as the mash was at least 80% corn. And as I say, the next video is going to be what is bourbon. I'll get into mash bills and whatnot for that in that video. But those are the basic kinds of whiskey that we, at least as beginners, need to concern ourselves with. Now, there is what they call American whiskey, which doesn't fit into any other legal category. There's something called light whiskey, which comes off the still at a proof between 160 and I believe it's 190. It's very nearly vodka, and it has its own regulations. Whiskey drinkers who tried it seemed pretty unanimously dislike it because it doesn't have as much flavor. And that is something that's key to whiskey. If you just want to get drunk, you can slug down the Jack Daniels or the Jim Beam, and the fact that they don't taste really wonderful won't be a factor. You can get a bottle of vodka, a bottle of Everclear, you can do whatever you want. But whether it's bourbon, scotch, Irish, rye, corn, whatever, people who love whiskey love it for the flavor. And so whiskey is a beverage, excuse me, an alcoholic beverage distilled. That's what you get with a thoroughly amateur production, a frog in the throat that won't hop on away. It's an alcoholic beverage distilled from a mash of grain that can cover everything from the strongest, roughest rot gut to the smoothest stuff, although I don't even know really what smooth means, but I'm using terms you might know. It's the smoothest stuff you ever tasted. And what you'll want to do as a beginner to whiskey, yeah, go ahead and try Jack Black. Go ahead and try Jim Beam White Label. There's nothing wrong with trying stuff, and you may like those. And the best whiskey for you is the whiskey you like, the way you like to drink it. I stole that from Daniel Whittington and Rex Williams of the Whiskey Tribe, but it's true. But what you'll probably wind up wanting to do is, whether you find you prefer bourbon or scotch or Irish or rye or corn or Japanese whiskey, what have you, what you'll want to do is find whiskey you like the taste of. If you just want to get drunk, you don't need the taste. But if you're getting into whiskey, it's because you want it to taste good, isn't it? You want something you like. And so whatever kind of whiskey it is, you'll want it to be whiskey you like the taste of, you like the smell of, you like the look of. I like looking at whiskey in a glass. I think it's pretty. Or even in a bottle sometimes. You get the sunlight shining just right through a bottle of whiskey and it lights up, and it's beautiful stuff. But anyway, I'm getting off the subject of the video now, which is what kinds of whiskey are there. And since I have covered that at least on a beginner's level, which is what this whole channel is all about, I'm just going to end it right there. Y'all have a good day.